So for my audience, I have my fiance, my grandma, and my cousin on FaceTime. He is holding the phone for me. Have you ever thought about global warming? Like actually thought about it? We see all these pictures on Facebook and we see all of these articles being shared about how the polar bear population is being diminished severely. But do you ever actually research it? According to National Geographic, the polar bears rely almost exclusively on a calorie-loaded diet of seals, and climate change is heating up the Arctic faster than anywhere else. So sea ice is shrinking about 14% per decade, which is completely depleting the source of food for polar bears because as it gets warmer, they can't survive. Their dependence on the sea ice makes them highly vulnerable to changing climate. Polar bears rely heavily on the sea ice environment for traveling, hunting, mating, resting, and in some areas, maternal dens. According to the World Wildlife Organization, the sea ice is really their platform for life. UW Polar Science Center researcher had said that they're capable of existing on land for part of the year, but the sea ice is where they obtain their main prey, which would be seals. They have determined that polar bears need to eat about 60% more than anyone had actually realized, which is why the population is depleting severely. The ice is how they primarily hunt for their food. What they do is they wait by the seal's breathing holes. So there's holes in the ice. They wait there till a seal pops up for air, and then what they do is they grab the seal by the neck, pull the seal out of the water, and that's how they hunt. That's their most successful way of obtaining food. But without the ice, there's no way for them to really hunt because they're not that fast. According to National Geographic, in the U.S. is where they're most threatened, and 60 to 80% of the world's population of polar bears is actually in Canada. By 2040, the ice in northeastern Canada and northern Greenland is primarily where their largest supply of ice is going to be, so there's a chance that they could migrate up that way. And if that's the case, then hopefully they'll make it that far depending on where they're at. By the year 2050, the number of polar bears is set to decline by at least 30%. So, as you can see, the climate change is greatly affecting the lives of the polar bears. There's countless research showing how it's changing their lives, making it harder for them to survive how they're used to. Without the ice, they can't hunt the seals. Without the seals, they're not going to survive, and eventually they might become extinct. They're in grave danger of that happening, actually. The climate change is something that needs to be addressed and fast before the world's population of polar bears is no longer around. Without the polar bears, there might be an overabundance of seals because they can live in the water as opposed to not being able to, like the polar bears, they can breathe underwater. So climate change is something that really needs to be addressed. It's not just a myth. It's not just a theory. It is something that is actually happening. And if we don't do something about it fast, we're going to see a grave decline of not only polar bears, but other animals that live in the ice, and the polar ice caps could melt, and who knows what devastation that could cause. According to NASA, the polar bears are actually the most affected by the seasonal and year-to-year decline of the sea ice because, like I said before, that's their main way of being able to hunt and to live because they can only live on land for so long, but they need that ice to rely on the food sources and their way of traveling and mating. And if they can't mate, there's no more polar bear babies, and if they can't produce babies, then the population is just going to continue to decline. And if they do continue to mate without a source of food, then they're still going to eventually, it'll lead to extinction. Because of the changing seasons, NASA has found that in the research they've conducted that an earlier spring leads to earlier ice melting, which leads to later time of it freezing. So the polar bears are thrown off because they're so used to having a set time of when usually they have more ice as opposed to less ice, so they know what to do. But now with the ice freezing later than usual, they don't have as much of their resources as they need in order to be able to survive. If they don't survive, eventually, like I have stated before, they'll go extinct, and that's not something we want. So global warming really is something that needs to be addressed, and I feel like it needs to be addressed now as opposed to later.